Hello and welcome to Laowai on Lianghui. Today I am joined by Shireen Fahad of Badi Foundation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
According to most reports, China has around 70 million people still living in poverty. And this is something that Xi Jinping has addressed and pledged to lift up these 70 million people out of poverty by 2020. Given the current economic slowdown in China, how feasible is this plan?
I think the answer to that question really depends on what you mean by lifting people out of poverty. I do think given China's material resources, it's possible to improve the standard of living for 70 million people. But I think it's really a superficial way of lifting people out of poverty. I think to really lift people out of poverty in a sustainable way, one would have to look at sort of some of the systemic inequalities, social and economic inequalities that underlie the dynamics of poverty and extremes of wealth and poverty, and I think that would certainly take a lot longer than
Such as?
4 or 5 years. I think, for example, access to education is one of them. You know, we see that urban populations, especially affluent urban populations, have access to much better educational and work opportunities than rural poor. Access to adequate medical care, housing facilities, and I think especially the access to opportunities that come with education, I think, are the most important. So,
sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, your foundation, the Badi Foundation, you, according to your website, you promote the alleviation of poverty through education.
Correct.
Could you perhaps give us a rundown of some of the things some of the programs that you run?
Yeah, I think Badi Foundation, we really work at the grassroots of society, and our focus is on assisting individuals in rural communities to participate in the development of their own communities. So we're trying to raise what you might call self-development capacity. We're trying to release the potential of these populations to really enhance their own well-being and the well-being of their families and of their local communities. Maybe they've never felt empowered to kind of take steps to address these needs themselves. They sort of feel kind of stuck with their lot in life. Nobody has ever, a lot of people have come and sort of said, do this or do that, but nobody's ever come along and really invited them to think in a meaningful way about the social and economic development of their communities or help them really become active agents of transformation. Both economically but also socially as well, to think about the culture of the community, the relationship between neighbors and families.
So like emphasizing a pride in the community and a sort of empowerment.
Empowerment and a sense of ownership,
right,
you know,
okay.
Feeling like, hey, this is our community, and we find too that people can become very resourceful. You know, they'll contribute their own family's money, they'll go out and work, they'll find money. We had one group of rural women in the south of Yunnan that they actually all, through their own money and through actually working on neighboring farms, they raised enough money to pave a road in their village.
Oh, okay.
And it was actually, and they had a lot of struggles and a lot of difficulties, but they managed to do it, and now they have a very nice paved road instead of a dirt road that would get very muddy. It's a very small thing, but if one can create that sense of initiative and draw on the existing aspirations and potential, we find that people in rural communities, they're people just like anybody else.
Right.
They have hopes, they have dreams, they have talents, and if you can bring high quality education to those populations in a way that helps them think about their communities, they actually can really do quite a lot to contributing to the development of the community in a long-term way. So.
Now my next question, obviously when you're talking about lifting these 70 million up out of poverty, these are going to be people that are in some of China's hardest to reach places, like the mountains of Guizhou and sort of the borderlands of Inner Mongolia, et cetera, et cetera. And they're going to be the elderly and left behind children quite often. How difficult is it going to be to reach these people, and how can they be lifted out of poverty?
It's wonderful if you think about China having this goal of lifting 70 million people out of poverty. And I think to achieve it, and especially to reach people in these hard to reach places, or to work with special populations such as the elderly and left behind children, there's a lot that local nonprofit organizations can do because we see that these grassroots NGOs, they are usually from the community. They tend to specialize in working with certain populations, and they're able to develop the capacity and resources to go to some of these very hard to reach places and to bring some of the educational programs or different kinds of aid and training to those types of populations. So I think that having the space and support for those types of organizations to come up and to contribute, to this vision of lifting the social and economic development of all Chinese people is very important.
There's been a little bit of media coverage of late about the new government regulations of NGOs, and particularly NGOs with foreign funding,
Right.
and registering with the PSB, et cetera, et cetera. How is this increased oversight of NGOs going to affect the alleviation of poverty in China?
Yeah, as you say, there's a draft law that's been issued governing registration of international NGOs. And I think we're still waiting to see the final regulation, but I think one thing that may be affected is definitely the funding to grassroots NGOs. Because according to the law, in order to provide funding to grassroots NGOs, an international NGO would have to be registered in mainland China, which is there's quite a process to do that. And right now, the vast majority of grassroots NGOs get quite a substantial amount of their funding from outside of China. So it certainly has the potential to impact the work of local social organizations, which those that are working in issues related to poverty alleviation would certainly, I think have an impact, especially on some of these populations, such as left behind children.